Welcome to St. Peter's Church and its historic churchyard. Much of this tour is adapted from St. Peter's Church, Faith in Action for 250 Years, which was published by Temple University Press in 2011. Parishioner David Stevens' chapter on the churchyard was a big help in putting this together, and also an audio tour, which I wrote about the same time. In our visit, we'll see how St. Peter's Churchyard is an urban oasis and a resting place for the living and the dead. We'll look at the yard and see how it was started and evolved. We'll look at some of the people who were buried there in the past and the trees that are growing in the yard. In the previous tour about the church's beginnings and its experience during the American Revolution, we saw how early members and clergy were a mixture of loyalists and patriots, and we saw some of the people's grave markers that are in the yard. For instance, Charles Willson Peale, you see in the upper picture here with his grave marker, and he was an ardent patriot in the Revolution, a captain in the Continental Army. And below him you see John and Elizabeth Cadwallader, and she is buried in the churchyard. He was one of George Washington's most trusted generals. And then on the right we see Jacob and Elizabeth Duché. Duché was the rector of Christ Church and St. Peter's, the United Congregations, and he was very much in favor of the Revolution in the early days, the movement to liberation, but then he changed his mind and left the city for London in 1777. So the churchyard was created when land was granted by the sons of William Penn to Christ Church for a new church in the southern section of town, and had plenty of land for burials. Christ Church had a problem that the land around the church that they set aside for burials was quickly being used up, so they had to go out into the country to get more land, and had a graveyard which you can still see today all the way at 5th and Arch Streets. At St. Peter's, the original land grant covered much of what we see today, and it was added to so that by 1782 it was the present size. They put a fence around it, but when the British occupied the city in the winter of 1777-78, they used the fence for firewood. So it was in 1784, after the Revolution, that the present brick wall was erected. The fence they put up not just to protect the burial land, but it was a pasture in those days. And people brought their cows out to graze every day, and then would take them home at night to milk them. And there was a pond, nice for the cows and the people living in the area. And the pond is the beginning of Little Dock Creek, which runs underneath today's Society Hill and comes out and meets Dock Creek at about 2nd and Spruce Streets. So that was the beginning of the yard, and but fast forward to the 1830s, things were changing for St. Peter's. It had been part of Christ Church since it opened in 1761, but in 1832 they decided to separate, and 4 years later, the longtime rector William White, who you see in the picture in the center, died at the age of 88. He had been rector since 1779 and was probably the last person in the city to be an adult and remember what happened during the Revolution. So then a new era started for the church, and they decided to celebrate it by erecting a tower and spire, which were designed by William Strickland in a Georgian style to match the old church. And you can see the two buildings from the west in these two pictures, and see how Strickland's tower match the church in style, if not in scale. But the tower was 15 feet higher than the Tower of Christ Church, which up until that time was the highest tower in the city. So this was St. Peter's own Declaration of Independence. And the bells that went into it were given by a church member, Benjamin Chew Wilcox, and they were made at the same foundry in London where the Liberty Bell was made. The first burial took place in 1760. Eventually, there were over 1,000 burials in the yard. And what you see here on the left is a plan of the yard that's found in a book that was published in 1879 that contains all the inscriptions in the yard up to that time. And each one is numbered and set out by section, so they're easily found when people are looking for their ancestors. And you can see from looking at the plan that it has 5 sections. To the right of the church itself, near 3rd Street, was Section A, and then below it Section B, and then around to C, D, and E. E is the only part of the yard in the part where the letters Section E are written, where no burials were held, and it is today the area where we have cremations, burial cremations. And so people can do that today, and unless you happen to have a space in a family plot, there are no full body burials anymore. And another option is a newly added obelisk at the east end of the Section E near the corner of 3rd and Pine, where common cremations are allowed, and you can have your name inscribed on the beautiful granite pyramid obelisk. Can I do that one again?
Start it right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
The plan for St. Peter's you can see here for the churchyard. It is.
It's okay. Relax.
The first burial took place in 1760, and eventually over 1,000 burials took place in the yard. On this slide you can see the plan of the churchyard that is contained in the book that was published in 1879 and contains all the inscriptions on grave markers in the yard, and each one is laid out by the section of the yard it's in and by number, so a grave can be easily found. You can see that there are 5 sections, starting with Section A just to the right or east of the church building, and below it Section B, then C, D, and E. And this Section E is the only place where burials can take place now, and those have to be cremations. Unless you happen to have a place in a family plot that still has room in it, there are no full body burials anymore. So you have the option of a stone in this area where the letters Section E show on this plan, and the near space in the picture to the right. Or you can have cremation ashes scattered at this obelisk at the east end towards the corner of 3rd and Pine Streets, and names inscribed on the stone. Looking at the trees in St. Peter's churchyard, we don't have many records that tell us when trees were planted or when they were cut down. So we can look at old images and get the sense of the big old trees that the church has had over many years. The upper left view was done in the 1870s, and you can see the tall trees, especially the one on the left, which is the red oak that we can still see today. The photograph on the right is probably done in the early days of photography. Below it is a postcard, probably around 1900. The other two images were probably taken in the 1930s or 40s, and so you can see the tall trees throughout the yard. And sorry, today. So here are the trees in the yard today. The oldest trees are the sycamores that are along Pine Street. The first two views show them from the east, from the west and then from the east. And then in the center you can see the red oak that you saw in the previous early 1870s image. Then there's a cedar of Lebanon near St. Peter's School, a ginkgo tree in the center of the yard, and then the beautiful flowering crab apples and dogwood trees in section E. So here's a plan of the yard today that's on a sign. There are two of them, one near the 4th Street gate and one near the 3rd Street, Pine Street gate. The blue marks show the most important figures buried in the yard, and the red circles show the stops on the audio tour that you could take of St. Peter's Churchyard. So we'll look at some heroes in American history. Here are two that are somewhat less known but have intriguing stories. The obelisk that I showed you before in the churchyard has the name of Samuel Francis on it. And he was a man from the West Indies of mixed race who came to New York in the 18th century and opened up Francis Tavern, which still exists in Lower Manhattan. And it was here that George Washington gathered his generals at the end of the Revolution and said farewell to them at the end of the war. And at that time, after that, Washington became President of the United States, and he invited Francis to come down and become his household steward in the President's house at 6th and Market Streets, which you see just below Washington's image. Francis was very helpful to Washington because he had his tavern in New York, and he listened while the British were occupying the city and passed on all sorts of useful information to George Washington. And John Nixon, who you see on the right, was a Philadelphia merchant who was active in the Revolution and was the sheriff of the city of Philadelphia at the time the Declaration of Independence was signed. And so he who was given the job of reading out the Declaration to the public on July 8th, 1776, which you see here in the image below, a contemporary image. But the bells were ringing all day long, the crowds gathered, and Nixon stepped out to read the Declaration, and that could have been a very terrifying moment for him because he was announcing treason to the British Crown. But he was fine, and he carried on and died and was buried at St. Peter's in 1808. And some military heroes during the Revolution that are in our churchyard are here. John Hazelwood was a captain in the Continental Army, and he was given the job of the defenses of Philadelphia when the British were approaching in the fall of 1777. If you heard the previous tour about the church during the Revolution, you'll recall that the Philadelphia Patriots ran a chain across the Delaware River to the New Jersey shore and put spikes, iron spikes into it, which were very handy at piercing British ship hulls. Hazelwood fought on in the Revolution and was buried here, died and was buried here in 1800. Next to him is Gustavus Cunningham, who was an Irish privateer who captured British ships off of France during the Revolution. He ended up in Philadelphia after the Revolution, died in 1819, and he has one of the more interesting gravestones in the yard, which you see to his left. The epitaph has many lines, each of which starts with the letters of his name. So there's CONYNGHAM, all saying fine things about the valiant Mr. Cunningham. Another military hero, but in the period after the American Revolution, was Stephen Decatur, who grew up very close to St. Peter's. His parents lived nearby and expected him to go into the clergy in the new Episcopal Church. But Stephen had other ideas, joined the U.S. Navy while Thomas Jefferson was president, and having problems with the Barbary pilots along the coast of Africa, along the Mediterranean Sea. And so along came the war with the Barbary pilots in Tripoli in 1803 and 1804. In December of 1803, Stephen Decatur captured the ketch of the Bay of Tripoli after a sharp fight. They renamed the boat the Intrepid, and it was used by Decatur in a daring raid to destroy the frigate USS Philadelphia, of which his father had been captain, and it had run aground and then been captured in Tripoli harbor in October. Several months later, in February of 1804, the Decatur took the Intrepid and disguised it as a Maltese merchant ship and put British flags on it, entered Tripoli harbor, and claimed that they had lost their anchors in a storm, and asked the permission to tie up alongside the captured USS Philadelphia. As the two ships touched, Decatur stormed aboard the Philadelphia with 60 men. They fought with swords and pikes and took control of the ship and began preparations to burn it. And the Philadelphia was set on fire. Waiting until he was sure that the fire had taken hold, Decatur was the last to leave the burning ship. He came back after this and continued to serve in the Navy, but was killed in a duel by a jealous colleague in 1820 and buried near his parents later on in St. Peter's churchyard. And much later on, his wife, Susan Wheeler, who had continued to live in Washington at their house near the White House, which you can still see today as the Decatur House, her remains were brought to Philadelphia and to be with her husband in 1988. Near the Decatur Monument, I have to back up. Can I do that? I don't think that works. Okay. I forgot something in there. No, I got it. Come on. So the Decatur Monument, which you see here with an eagle on top, marks Decatur's grave, and the eagle was restored at the time of our 250th anniversary, and you can see it before above and after below. Near the Decatur Monument is a marker which honors the tribal chieftains who were buried in St. Peter's Churchyard in January of 1793. We don't know where they were buried, but we have their marker here. They had come from the Ohio River Valley and different parts of that area where settlers were moving in, and there were conflicts between the natives and the Americans. And so they came to Washington to meet with They came to Philadelphia to meet with George Washington and the Senate over the terms of the treaties. Unfortunately, soon after they arrived, 7 of them died of smallpox, and another one lingered on until April. And so it was a sad chapter in Philadelphia's history. "1793 was a bad year in the city. In the summer, the yellow fever hit. Refugees from Santo Domingo, or what we know today as Haiti, came when yellow fever had struck there. And people were devastated by this disease. 1 in 5 Philadelphians died of it. The leading doctor in the city was Benjamin Rush, and according to current practice, it was believed that if you would bleed people, they would get rid of the disease, which was the last thing they needed. But among the refugees was a French doctor who'd had experience with the yellow fever, and he knew that people could recover if they had calm, cool, restful settings. And so he and French merchant and banker Stephen Girard set up a hospital out in the country at what is now 17th and Spring Garden Streets, and cared for people there, and many of them recovered. But during that terrible time, the city turned to Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who had recently formed the Free African Society to help slaves gaining their freedom to adapt to their new life. And they were asked to go and help bring in the ailing people, the yellow fever, and to bury the dead, because people thought that blacks wouldn't get the disease, which was certainly not true. You'll remember Absalom Jones from the previous tour, that he was the slave of a member of St. Peter's, and he was married at St. Peter's in January of 1770, which you can see in the parish register here. Richard Allen had been a slave of Benjamin Chew, who we talked about before, and so the two of them were freed blacks and were able to start the society, and did so much to help their fellow citizens during this terrible period. And in return for that, they got accused of stealing from the sick and the dying. And they were so outraged by this that when the fever passed, when the frost came and killed off the mosquitoes that caused it, they wrote a refutation of it and established their value and dignity in the community. Two other people who made great contributions to our city and our country were Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Nicholas Biddle. Eliza Pinckney had a plantation near Charleston, South Carolina, where her slaves taught her how to grow indigo and turn it into dye. And so she started this industry in America, which we still see everywhere in all the blue jeans that are worn in this country. She came to Philadelphia when she was ill in 1793 because her sons were members of the United States Congress while Philadelphia was the capital of the country in that 10-year period from 1790 to 1800. Alas, she died, and at her funeral, George Washington was one of her pallbearers. She was buried in our yard, and the marker that you see here stands underneath a southern magnolia tree to honor her. On the right, you see Nicholas Biddle. He is buried in Section B, very close to the Osage orange trees, which stand along that southern border of the churchyard. Biddle's connection with the Osage oranges is quite interesting. When Thomas Jefferson, as president, made the Louisiana Purchase from Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, he needed Lewis and Clark to go and explore this territory, which basically doubled the size of the United States. And so Lewis and Clark came to Philadelphia and were trained and prepared by the American Philosophical Society, of which Nicholas Biddle was a member, and they sent back all sorts of flora and fauna. This was their job, to look at the territory, to meet with the people who lived in that area, and to find a route to the Pacific Ocean. So seeds of the beautiful Osage oranges that grew in the Ohio River Valley were sent back to a nurseryman who planted some in the St. Peter's churchyard and at Christ Church. So here they are today, but these are not the original trees. They are the descendants, and sadly 2 of them will be removed soon, but cuttings have been taken and will grow up again in our churchyard. In the east front of the church, you can see on the left the beautiful Palladian window, and below it various grave markers. The one on the left, which is you can see in detail just to the right of that image, was the stone of the Bingham family. The Binghams were founders of the church. And then in the center, underneath the window, the one you see in detail just below the Bingham marker, was the marker for the Sims family, another founding family. And one of the Sims daughters married Benjamin Wynkoop, who's the man who owned Absalom Jones. And then to the right is George Mifflin Dallas, who was mayor of Philadelphia, as U.S. Senator, and then became the Vice President of the United States under James Polk. And you can see his stone there over on the right, on the ground, on the right-hand side of the church. I mentioned Benjamin Chew earlier, and in the previous tour, you learned that he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania in the colonial era, and was close to the Penn family, and had to play his cards very carefully during the American Revolution. He had the beautiful house Clifton in Germantown, which still stands and is open to the public. He was buried here in 1810. You can still read his stone quite well, and so it's interesting to see him. And then his grandson was Benjamin Chew Wilcox, the donor of the bells to the new tower in 1842. And you can see one of the bells here. And if you look at the 2 images of the church with this stone monument more prominent in the right-hand image, you can see that it looks like the tower and the spire of St. Peter's. William Strickland, as I said before, designed the tower, and Wilcox died just 3 years later, so it is presumed that Strickland designed the monument to Wilcox, which you see in detail in the center. And because Strickland was very careful to maintain the Georgian style in his tower, he had to allow himself to put in a little bit of Gothic detail because that was very popular at the time that the tower was built. Now, Benjamin Carr is buried in this unusual looking monument. He was the organist of St. Peter's and other churches and choir master. He was a music publisher here and in Baltimore, and he was Mr. Music in Philadelphia. He founded the Musical Fund Society, which exists to this day to support music and musicians in the city. When he died in 1831, Strickland once again was asked to design his monument. And looking at the design of it, one wonders what on earth it is. If you look carefully, you can see that it's a tripod with animal legs holding up an urn, a funerary urn. Now, at the time Carr died, Strickland was designing the Merchants Exchange, which stands today at 3rd and Walnut Streets. And on top of it, you can see what is called the Choragic Monument of Lysicrates, which is an ancient Athenian monument dedicated to a man named Lysicrates who won the annual chorus prize and had a monument erected in his honor. And because Benjamin Carr was the most important leader of choruses and choirs in Philadelphia, Strickland thought to put the upper part of the Choragic monument as Carr's monument, with, instead of a great urn with smoke rising up to the god of music Apollo, it was a funerary urn. And so Strickland has this wonderful connection with Benjamin Carr and ancient Athens. And you can see this piece of music that Carr composed and published called The Siege of Tripoli, and with Stephen Decatur buried not very far away, one can suppose that perhaps they play it together or sing it together in the night. We'll close, last but not least, with Andrew Weinstein. Weinstein was born in Russia as a Jew. He traveled as a young man to the Middle East. He encountered Anglican missionaries in Egypt and converted to Christianity, went to London, was ordained as an Anglican priest, and traveled around the world. He went to South Africa, and he came to America in the early 1900s, and eventually to Philadelphia and to St. Peter's, where he became the missioner to the immigrant community that was settling around in the area around St. Peter's as people came here at the foot of Washington Avenue, where the immigration station was. Weinstein by this time spoke 7 languages, and so was a tremendous help in working with these people to get them adjusted to their new life in a new country. He was buried here in 1915. And so we close with St. Peter's Churchyard as an urban resting place. Our usage today is honoring and preserving our history while making the space work for the parish with things like the maze that was put in the winter of 2015 as a place to have parties and gather the congregation together in nice weather. It's a place for visitors and neighbors and their dogs to come. It's a quiet place in the city to rest for 10 minutes or for eternity. Thank you very much.